Hong Kong, a beautiful city with a rich, flourishing culture, occupied by a people who get to enjoy the freedoms of democracy and, oh no, don't look at that. Wait, no, don't look over there either. So you really want to know what's going on? Well, fine. Acknowledging the risk of YouTube shadow banning me for even talking about this, we'll have to start at the start of the First Opium War. It's the late 1800s, and Britain is selling China so much opium, Walter White would have an aneurysm. And when the Emperor tried to stop it, Britain gave him the old walloping and took this island as a trading post. And since that war was so great, they decided to have another one where they took even more land. But since trilogies are so overplayed these days, they sent this funny looking fella to lease more land. And never let it be said that diplomacy doesn't work, cause this dude got more land than the two wars combined. So what's the catch? They only leased the land for 99 years, but to Lord Beans on Toast, that was as good as forever. Don't worry, chaps, we'll never need to give the land back. We're the most powerful nation in history. I mean, what could possibly change in 100 years?
你好.
It's the 90s, and the lease is up. And so is mainland Taiwan, otherwise known as Communist China. And they weren't coming back for 30%, they were coming back for everything. And in a move that will likely shock American viewers, Britain actually honored a treaty and decided to not only give the leased land back, but all of Hong Kong. And in an attempt to pretend like they cared about the Hong Kongers, Britain added the condition that Hong Kong gets to keep its capitalism, governance, and way of life for at least 50 years. A promise the Chinese government definitely intended to keep. And as the clock struck midnight on June 30th, 1997, Hong Kong was officially Chinese again. And while this event marked for many the official end of the British Empire, it marked an uncertain future for millions of Hong Kong citizens. So remember when I said the CCP definitely intended to keep that non-infringement policy in place? Yeah, that went about as well as you'd expect. Like that weird guy staring at you from across the room at the party, they slowly encroached until they went for the big moves.
Call me asparagus!
You see, there were a lot of things about Hong Kong the CCP wasn't exactly fond of. Hong Kong was really attached to its democracy and its basically being China but kinda not-ness. In fact, it's the only place in China that holds remembrances for that totally fake event that never happened. So they decided that 50 years was kind of a long time, you know? So they started making moves. A little choosing of friendly politicians here, a little indoctrination of the school system there, and the people were not very happy about that. Things boiled over in 2014 when massive pro-democracy protests ended in failure, and things went downhill from there. Barring politicians from office, arrest of pro-democracy advocates,
Get your hand off my penis!
strange disappearances, the whole 9 yards. Tensions between the people of Hong Kong and their own government soared. And in 2019, China finally pulled out the big guns. The Hong Kong legislature introduced the Fugitive Offenders and Mutual Legal Assistance in Criminal Matters Legislation Amendment Bill 2019 to be voted on. And yes, they name all of their laws like that. The extradition bill made it so that people arrested in Hong Kong could be sent to the mainland for trial, meaning that whole separate governance thing would basically be gone. And can you guess how the people felt about that one? After some minor protests got nowhere, somewhere between 270,000 and 1 million people took to the streets to protest on June 9th. And that's a pretty wide range of people, but you try counting everyone, man, it's hard. Undeterred, the Hong Kong legislature tried to push the bill forward anyways, resulting in the entire building being surrounded and clashes with police and protesters. The legislature suspended the bill, hoping that this whole fighting for freedom nonsense would just blow over. But fun fact, it actually got way worse. The protesters now had 5 key demands, including freedom of the arrested, withdrawal of the bill, and retraction of a statement that the protests were riots. The police later did walk this last one back, saying that only 5 people were rioting that day, which, you know, sounds like the lamest riot I've ever heard of, but I'm sure they tried. As the days went on, things continued to get bad. On the anniversary of the handover, protesters broke into the Legislative Council with little police resistance, trashing the place. Wait, are we still talking about Hong Kong? Protests now spread throughout the region, and clashes between police and protesters skyrocketed. Things Things got so bad that at one point a group of 700 suspected Triad members just walked into a train station and started going ham, egg, and cheese on whoever they saw, but mostly protesters. And despite over 24,000 calls to the police, they totally unsuspiciously showed up 40 minutes late and exactly 1 minute after the crowd dispersed, despite, you know, being all over the streets. This incident, along with police arresting people in hospitals, suspicious self-unaliving of protesters, and generally going Hong Kong phooey on people, turned just about everyone against the Hong Kong government. Not to mention international condemnations were rolling in like an avalanche. In response to this turn against them, the Hong Kong police decided to look inside themselves, stop using so much violence, and officially apologize. Nah, I'm just kidding. They did the train station thing themselves a month later and started using live rounds. After months of protesting, police slugfesting, and a display of hand-holding that stretched over 50 kilometers, somehow without blocking traffic at all, which is a feat in itself, honestly, the Hong Kong legislature announced the official withdrawal of the bill. And while this was a major victory, the people were kind of way past that at this point. They wanted all 5 demands answered. Some even called for independence. Across the city, Winnie the Pooh dolls continued to be decimated. Pepe the Frog was everywhere for some reason. What started as protest now seemed to be a revolution. By November, there was a general strike across the city, and students had barricaded themselves inside of a university. This led to a standoff as police surrounded the school in what's known as the Siege of the Chinese University of Hong Kong, which is like the coolest thing they could have called that. After police managed to clear it out and claim that it was a weapons factory, which, to be fair, they weren't wrong. All the people there just kind of went to the next school, which started the siege of the Hong Kong Polytechnic Institute. If I had a nickel for every time. At this point, the protest had been going on for months, and while the bill had been scrapped, most people's anger wasn't satiated. But finally, it was time for the Hong Kong elections, which saw a record turnout of voters. And can ya guess who won? Landslide isn't the word I'd use, more of an electoral avalanche. Nearly 90% of district council seats went to pro-democracy candidates. This was seen as a major victory by many, a final FU to Beijing, and protests became far more sparse after this point. Well, that, and I kind of forgot to mention that in October, the government had implemented an anti-mask law, which definitely was not going to have any unforeseen consequences a few months later. The pandemic also led to less protesting, as people didn't want to get sick and police actually had an excuse to break up public gatherings now. The eyes of the media turned away from Hong Kong because of the pandemic. And that's when Mr. What's Up Beijing, Xi Jinping, took matters into his own hands. The Beijing government decided to draft a new law that would stop secession, foreign interference, and terrorism in Hong Kong. And since this was the mainland government's doing instead of their local legislature as it had been, there was nothing the people of Hong Kong could do. The law passed unanimously because, yeah, of course it did. The law banned using anti-Beijing slogans or making anti-Beijing art. Several pro-democracy and pro-independence groups were forced to disband. Undeterred by the law, voters looked to elect more pro-democracy candidates to the Legislative Council, only for a group of the candidates to be disqualified by the government and the election to be postponed. The election system was overhauled to make sure that only patriots could rule Hong Kong. Arrests for subverting state power spiked, and school curriculums were changed to remove any mention of Tiananmen Square. As the world looked away, the worst had come to pass for the city. The protests had failed, and a mass migration of Hong Kongers from the region saw the city's population drop by tens of thousands. And as of today, years later, China maintains its grip on the once hopeful city. Wait, that's it? Yeah, so when making this video, I had no idea things went so downhill after the pandemic. Frankly, I thought the protesters won. But you know, Hong Kong is a very special place with an incredible history that I barely got to touch on. And while things look bleak now, the spirit of freedom and democracy lives on in the hearts and minds of the protesters who stood up against insurmountable odds for what they believed in. And in them, the promise of a better future remains. Also, I found this article, so they must be planning something.